The origin of every wound is a craving for belonging. You think they left you, but they didn't. Not first. Long before they walked away, you had already stepped out of yourself, not by choice, by adaptation. Alfred Adler once said, "The most basic human drive is not pleasure, it's belonging." And the tragedy is this: to belong, you began to vanish. To be accepted, you started to fracture. You learned, quietly, instinctively, that certain parts of you had to go. The parts that cried too loud, that asked too much, that felt too deeply. So you trimmed yourself down. You smiled when it hurt. You became what others needed. But in doing so, you stopped being what you needed. You call it heartbreak. You call it betrayal. But Adler would call it compensation. A desperate attempt to be seen by others, because you no longer dared to see yourself. And here's the most painful truth. You didn't just lose people. You lost your own presence. That voice inside that once said, "I matter," grew faint, then silent, then gone. This is what Adler meant by the inferiority complex. Not that you are less, but that, somewhere along the way, you began to believe you had to earn your right to exist. And every time you were abandoned after that, it wasn't just them leaving. It was the echo of you, repeating a pattern you already lived within. No one can leave you as deeply as you've left yourself. So the question is no longer, why did they abandon me? But, when did I decide I wasn't worth staying for? And maybe that question is the beginning of your return. Picture this: a mirror covered in dust. Not because time forgot it, but because you did. In Adler's view, this isn't just a metaphor. It's your life. You don't look into that mirror because you know what it reflects. The parts you had to leave behind to be accepted. The ones you were told were shameful, dramatic, or weak. That mirror holds the child who once believed they were worthy, before the world convinced them otherwise. And now, you walk past it every day. You smile in public. You perform strength, but you can't shake the feeling that something is off. Because it is. You're living in contradiction, projecting confidence while hiding deep insecurity, longing to be seen, after making yourself invisible. Adler believed that we all develop a self-image early in life, an internal narrative of what we must be in order to belong. And when that image is built on rejection, you stop trying to reflect your truth and start trying to perform one that's safer. But a mirror covered in dust still reflects. It waits. It remembers. The question is, do you have the courage to wipe it clean and finally face who you left behind? Not to fix it, not to hate it, but to reclaim it. Because that's where belonging begins again. Not in others, but in your own reflection. No one wakes up and decides to disappear. We vanish slowly, quietly, in the name of love. Alfred Adler believed that feelings of inferiority are not born. They are formed, not through logic, but through early emotional impressions. As a child, you didn't have words yet, but you felt and you sensed, in ways you couldn't explain, that being you wasn't quite acceptable. Maybe you were too emotional, too quiet, too intense, too different, and the people around you, well-meaning or not, didn't know how to receive that. So, you adjusted, you adapted, you became easier to love, you smiled more, you asked for less. You began to shape yourself into what they could handle. Adler called this the development of a lifestyle, a silent, unconscious strategy formed in early childhood, designed not to express your truth, but to secure belonging. A child is not passive. He builds his own conclusions about life and then lives as if they were true. Alfred Adler. Your conclusion was simple. If I become what they want, maybe I won't be left behind. But here's the tragedy. In becoming who they could accept, you stopped being who you are. And now, years later, you feel the emptiness, the confusion, the inability to say no, the guilt for simply existing. But it all traces back to that first unspoken belief. Love requires disappearance. So you became an expert in erasing yourself. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Your anger, your needs, your voice, your presence. And the worst part? You were praised for it. They called your absence maturity, your silence, politeness, your boundaries, too much. But Adler warned us. The greater the need for approval, the further one moves from their own direction. You didn't just abandon your voice, you abandoned your inner compass. But here's the truth. That compass is still there, buried, rusty, whispering. And maybe now, it's time to listen again, to follow the path that doesn't require you to vanish. Because who you are was never too much. It was simply never understood. There's a version of you that the world knows, the one that's helpful, calm, agreeable, always fine. But here's what Adler knew. That version isn't really you. It's the version you created to be tolerated. He called it a fictional final goal. A self-image you construct to survive, not because it's true, but because it keeps you from being rejected. We invent an ideal self to compensate for the self we fear we are. Alfred Adler, paraphrased. You learned, often before you even knew you were learning, that certain traits got you approval. Being easygoing, being needed, being predictable. So you wore those traits like a mask, not out of deceit, out of necessity. Over time, the mask became a habit. The habit became a personality, and the personality became a prison. Now, when someone asks, "Who are you?" you hesitate, because you've built a life on being what others prefer. But you still feel the friction, the tension, the quiet rebellion inside you saying, "This isn't me." Adler didn't see this as weakness. He saw it as the inevitable result of a society that rewards conformity over authenticity. When your worth is measured by your utility, you begin to shape your identity around what's useful, not what's real. And eventually, you forget what you actually want, what you enjoy, what you feel. Because the script you've written for your life never asked for those things. It only asked, what do I have to be to not be left again? But here is the truth. The self you created to protect you is the same self that keeps you invisible. And invisibility is its own form of abandonment. So now, when your smile feels hollow, when your words don't sound like yours, when your body says no but your mouth says yes, that's not failure. That's the mask cracking. And that crack might be the first sign that the real you is still in there, waiting, not to be perfect, just to be seen. You say you want to change. You say you want to stop being hurt, overlooked, forgotten. But if you're honest, painfully honest, you're still waiting for someone to see you, to rescue you, to love you in a way that makes the emptiness stop. You imagine a partner, a parent, a friend, a guide, someone who will finally say, "You are enough. You can stop trying now." But that someone never arrives. Not because you're unworthy, but because the person you're waiting for is you. Adler believed in one truth above all. We are not determined by what happens to us, but by the meaning we give it and what we choose to do with it. Most people don't suffer from abandonment. They suffer from the story they've built around it. And your story? It says, "I was left because I wasn't enough." So you try to become more kind, more giving, more perfect. But every time you try harder to be loved, you deepen the wound of your own absence. Because in the language of the soul, trying to earn love is the loudest form of self-rejection. You still believe that if you do everything right, someone will choose you. But Adler called this the illusion of control, the false belief that if we compensate enough, we can prevent rejection. The truth is brutal. You're not in control of who leaves you. You're only in control of whether you stay when they do. The moment you begin to show up for yourself, you'll see how much you were projecting that responsibility onto others. You wanted them to love the parts of you you were afraid to touch. You wanted them to fix the cracks you wouldn't look at. But love, real love, even the kind you give to yourself, doesn't come to fix. It comes to witness, to stand beside what's broken without pretending it isn't. Adler called this the courage to be imperfect, to face the truth of your pain without numbing it, escaping it, or decorating it with performance. You've been waiting for someone to come and validate your worth, but no one can give you what you keep abandoning in yourself. So maybe it's time to stop waiting and start returning to the place in you that still aches, still hopes, still believes, not in someone else, but in your own ability to no longer leave yourself behind. You were taught to be agreeable, to keep the peace, to be the one who understands, forgives, adjusts. You believed that if you were kind enough, accommodating enough, they wouldn't leave. And so, over time, you began to say yes when everything inside you screamed no. Adler saw this not as a personality trait, but as a strategy rooted in fear, a fear of not belonging, a fear of disappointing the people you depend on for worth. The greater the need to be liked, the greater the risk of losing oneself. Alfred Adler, paraphrased. And that's exactly what happened. You didn't lose yourself in one moment. You lost yourself in 1,000 small agreements. Each one was a negotiation where the cost was your integrity. But here's what Adler believed. To reclaim your dignity, you must first reclaim your right to refuse. To say, no, I don't want that. No, that hurts me. No, I'm not available for that version of myself anymore. Saying no is not a betrayal. It's a boundary. And boundaries are not walls. They are lines drawn in honor of your own value. When you say no, for the first time clearly without apology, you're not rejecting others. You're reclaiming yourself. Yes, they might pull away. Yes, some may not understand, but you'll feel something you haven't felt in a long time. Solidity. Because a no spoken from truth is a door closing on self-abandonment and a window opening to finally, quietly, coming home to yourself. Not all respect is earned by speaking. Some of it is carved in silence. You spent so much of your life explaining yourself, apologizing for your needs, justifying your existence in spaces that only tolerated you. And you believed that if you could just be clear enough, calm enough, kind enough, they would finally treat you with the care you craved. But Alfred Adler taught something different. It is the individual's sense of value that determines how they relate to the world, not the other way around. The truth is, you don't need to prove yourself. Not to people who misunderstand you. Not to those who diminish you. Silence isn't withdrawal. It's sovereignty. It is the moment when you stop begging for dignity and start embodying it. It's the moment when you don't flinch under misinterpretation, when you realize that being misunderstood isn't a threat, it's a filter. Because those who demand your explanations are often the ones who were never really listening. And those who truly see you, they don't need paragraphs. They can hear you, even in your stillness. Adler spoke of social interest, the ability to connect with others without losing yourself in them. And silence, in its truest form, is an act of alignment with your own worth. It says, I don't need to be loud to be whole. I don't need to beg to belong. I no longer abandon myself for the illusion of peace. And in that moment, when you choose not to explain, not to react, not to chase, you will feel something sacred. Presence. Yours. Unapologetic. Grounded. Unmoved. Because silence is not what happens when you give up. It's what rises when you finally return. Under all the layers, the roles, the masks, the silences, the scars, you're still there. Maybe quieter now, maybe dust-covered and cautious, but not gone. Adler believed that your past does not define you. Your pain is not your identity. The important thing is not what one is born with, but what use one makes of that equipment. And so the question is no longer, why did they leave me? Or even, why did I leave myself? The real question is, now that you know, will you return to your voice, to your direction, to your life? Not as an apology, but as a quiet revolution, because you're still in there, and you've waited long enough.